In the lectionary reading for this morning, Matthew relates yet another of Jesus' teaching parables. This one dealing with the forgiven and the unforgiven servants. The servant who is forgiven his debt of $1 bazillion refuses to forgive his fellow servant who owes him only, say, $10,000. New Testament scholar Charles Cussar suggests that we pay close attention to what the story leaves out. The negative space between verse 27, where one man's debt is forgiven, and verse 28, where that same man demands payment from his fellow servant who owes him money, comprises an abyss of considerable proportions. Cussar states there is a remarkable gap in the parable. On hearing of his release from the obligation, the servant shows no appropriate response, no rejoicing, no gratitude, no celebrating with wife and children who are spared imprisonment, no reflection about the meaning of freedom. We hear only that on the way out, he refuses the pleas of a colleague. The gap in the parable has to be taken seriously. The first servant clearly has not discovered forgiveness. The parable's ending is dark as the king sends his obdurate servant off to be tortured. It is at this point where the analogy between the just king and our merciful God diverges. This parable must be treated as a parable, not an example of what God actually does in the world. Nevertheless, the point still remains. For the people of God, forgiving as one is forgiven is very, very, very serious business. The implication for us is clear. Unless we can comprehend unfathomable and extraordinary grace, and this often requires an epiphany or multiple epiphanies, we will not be inclined to manifest it. The following story from my life is one in a bazillion that illustrates what might happen in the crack between verses 27 and 28. The ox blood colored vintage suitcase was rectangular shaped, shoebox sized, probably designed for cosmetics. It had belonged to my mother when she was a teenager. Inside this ignoble, diminutive trunk, I had carefully packed 2 fireballs, a piece of bazooka bubble gum, a pair of socks, and my little stuffed dog, whom I had named P.F. for P.F. Foster, the little old man who owned the country store in our town. P.F. Foster sold and, more often than not, gave away penny candy to those of us who walked by his humble market on our way home from school. I tied a piece of yellow yarn to the handle of the suitcase, opened my second floor bedroom window, and lowered my box of treasures down to the snow-covered ground below. I was running away from home. I was 6 years old. My mother and I had disagreed about something, and she had admonished me. Being scolded was always more than my fragile psyche could handle. In that moment, I hated my mother, and I was determined to do something that would pay her back for my anger and hurt. I just knew she would be sorry when she discovered that I had taken the suitcase and run away. I tiptoed down the stairs and slipped out the front door without my mother noticing. I trudged through the snow to my ox blood coffer, already dusted with white flakes. I untied the yarn and left it in the snow as a clue. Gripping the handle tight, I was all ready to go. Suddenly, however, I realized that in my haste, I had forgotten my coat, hat, and mittens. I was standing in the cold of an upstate New York snowstorm, and my hands were quickly numbing, and the wind was beginning to penetrate my heavy sweater, which had been knitted by my grandmother. Shivering, I made my way through the rapidly accumulating snow to the barn and huddled in a dark corner to come up with a plan. I was very cold, but still far too angry to go back to the house. I had an idea. I left the freezing barn and plowed through the snow drifts to the back of the house. I kicked the snow and ice away from the cellar hatchway and pulled on the door until it finally opened. As it closed behind me, I breathed in the dank warmth, relieved to be out of the howling wind and piercing snow. I moved through the darkness to where the furnace was and crouched on the cement floor. My little icy wet fingers fumbled with the latch on the suitcase. I pulled out my socks, put them on my hands like mittens, and waited, wondering if my mother had finally realized I was gone. Once I felt the chill leave my body, I began to obsess about where I was hiding. I hated the cellar. It was really dark down there, with only a little light penetrating through the small snow-covered windows. And there were cobwebs, spider webs, draping the rough-hewn joists above me and in every corner and every window. I scanned the shadows for spiders, mice, and monsters. The wall closest to me comprised floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with homemade canned corn, string beans, tomatoes, peaches, pickles, and venison. I pulled PF from the suitcase and held him close. I ate a fireball and barely noticed the familiar burning inside my mouth. I waited and waited. Eventually, I could hear my mother outside calling for me. Finally, she had discovered my absence. I listened as she called and called my name. I started to feel a little sorry for her. I started to feel a little guilty, but I was still hurt and mad, and I wasn't going to give in. I counted the jars of tomatoes and corn on the shelves, first from the top down and then from the bottom up. I chewed my bubble gum. I tried to blow bubbles. I counted canned goods. I don't know how much time went by. I suspect I may have dozed off, exhausted from the stress of it all. Suddenly, though, I noticed that all I could hear was the haunting sound of the wind. I could no longer hear my mother's voice calling me. I knew I was alone. I felt dreadful. My stomach knotted. Hot tears welled in my eyes. I knew I had done something horribly wrong, and I knew it was time to give in and face my mother. I tiptoed up the stairs to the door that opened into the kitchen. I could smell dinner cooking, but there was no sign of my mother. I took my suitcase back to my bedroom. Where could she be? I lamented. My heart sank as I saw how much snow had fallen. What if something had happened to her while she was out looking for me? Sobbing, I sat just inside the front door, watching and waiting for her. Fear, shame, and leftover anger poured out and washed over me. When my mother finally came through the door, I could tell she was cold and tired, worried and angry. "Where have you been?" she asked in a stern but muted voice. "Do you know you could have frozen to death out there?" "I was in the cellar," I confessed. "I'm really sorry." "In the cellar," she repeated. So, I had been hiding, not lost in the snow, and she knew I had done this to hurt her, to make her worry, to make her look for me. She removed her coat, hat, gloves, and boots in silence and turned toward the kitchen. And then she broke the silence. "Are you hungry?" I gulped back my tears. At 6, I could imagine no greater sin than the one I had just committed. Rightfully, my mother had pronounced me guilty, but then granted me forgiveness, absolution. And that was the end of it. Nothing more was said. Today, some 50 years later, I think about that late winter afternoon and the forgiveness I was given. I think about the grace I experienced that night at the dinner table when nothing of the day's events was reported to my father. In those moments, and in many, many other times throughout my life, I have experienced and been taught in minute detail how to be forgiving. If I don't draw on that extraordinary grace and practice what I have learned, it's no one's fault but my own. Amen.